This next question, students, is pertaining to the socio-religious reform movements that had happened in our country during the 19th century. Now let us understand, students, what the question is trying to ask us. Basically, it is saying that we need to trace the rise and growth of socio-religious reform movements with special reference to young Bengal and the Brahmo Samaj. Now herein, students, again, first of all, we check two things. Number one, what is the directive? And number two, what are the keywords that will help us in answering this particular question? Now, as you can see, students, the directive given here is trace. Now, when we talk about trace, students, it's just like evaluate, enumerate, elucidate. So basically, when we are tracing any particular development of a particular organization or a movement, etc., we just need to give a descriptive / narrative analysis. Apart from that, students, if you will see the question, it is again divided into two parts, wherein the first keyword is the growth of socio-religious movements and the second keyword is Young Bengal movement and Brahmo Samaj. So let's write it down here. Our keyword is growth of socio-religious movements. And the second keyword is Young Bengal plus Brahmo Samaj. Now this very short exercise, students, gives us a very good insight so as to what we have to write in our answer. Now let's say if we look at this particular question, we divide our question in three parts. That is our introduction, our body and our conclusion. As a part of the introduction, students, it is very easy to understand that we will just explain the time period of socio-religious reform movements and why it started in the first place. As a part of the body, students, we'll proceed further and first of all give 2 or 3 good reasons of the rise and growth of socio-religious reform movements. And in the second part of our body, we will elaborate the key features of Brahmo Samaj and Young Bengal movement. Finally, students, we'll proceed towards our conclusion and tell the examiner how both of these organizations were helpful in creating a socio-religious reform or whether they were unsuccessful in doing the same. Okay, so let's proceed further. Now, first of all, students, let's start with the introduction. I had told you that in the introduction, we can simply just talk about the origin of socio-religious reform movements. What was the reason in 19th century because of which they developed? So basically, students, we first of all talk about the origin, that is early 19th century, in which we see the coming of socio-religious reform movements in India. Now, as a part of the introduction of these movements, students, we see this was a result of the introduction of Western education and the spread of Western ideas such as Enlightenment and rationalism. So students, we know that once the European companies came to our country, with them they brought their own culture, their own literature, which was very easily adapted by the Indian intelligentsia or the middle class who were into education. Now, this newly developed class in our country, the intelligentsia, started reading about the concepts such as Renaissance, Enlightenment, rationalism, which were very popular in Europe. And in a way, they tried to imbibe the same ideals within the Indian society in the name of socio-religious reform movements. As a part of the students, many movements and organizations were set up, and herein we have to specifically talk in special reference to Young Bengal movement and Brahmo Samaj. So that is why in the second part of our introduction, we can write that how the Brahmo Samaj and Young Bengal movement were playing key roles as a part of these movements. Moving on, students, we directly proceed towards our body, wherein first of all, we'll talk about the first part of the question, that is the causes of the rise and growth of socio-religious reform movements. Now, students, in the 19th century, as I had already told you, European companies had come to our country, particularly the British, who had started imbibing their own literature and culture within the fabric of Indian society. As a part of the students, many people were influenced by these European ideas. So one of the biggest reasons was the influence of modern ideas such as French and American revolutions, which led to the growth of socio-religious reform movements in India. Apart from that, students, there is a concept known as British liberalism. Now, what is British liberalism? Basically, the white man believed that the Asian civilizations were below standard and we were quote unquote barbaric civilizations. And that is why it was the white man's burden to civilize the natives of our country, and hence they started incorporating their ideas of a society, their ideas of a fraternity into our country's social fabric. Apart from that, students, I had told you that as a part of the introduction of these European ideas, a new class emerged in our country, which were the educated elites, also known as Indian intelligentsia. Okay, so these educated elite students such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Devendranath Tagore, etc. started reading about these European ideals and started talking about the social ills that were prevailing in our country with special reference towards women's rights and their education. Apart from that, students, we see that this term socio-religious reform movements, if broken down, talks about two components. One is the social reform, such as the causes of women rights, women education, etc. And the second one is the religious component, students. We all know that there was a lot of Brahmanical orthodoxy, the caste system was prevailing, the concept of untouchability was widespread in our society. Hence, students, we see that there were certain religious reforms as well that were happening as a part of 19th century reform movements. Now, here in students, some important examples that can be given by you include the Arya Samaj movement. So, Arya Samaj movement started the Shuddhi movement, in which they wanted to revive the Brahmanical culture. Apart from that, students, you will also see that there were certain reforms in the Brahmanical orthodoxy, wherein people such as Rajaram Mohan Roy started the Brahmo Samaj, and they wanted to do away with certain ideas such as polytheism or idol worship. Apart from that, students, as I had already told you, in social reforms, we see the rights of women were highlighted again and again. Their condition was very pitiable, and that is why many Indian men came to the forefront to rescue the condition of women in our country. So these students are certain causes. We have some more here. So we can see the social conditions. Social conditions were really bad during 19th century. A lot of caste prejudice was prevalent in our country. Women were in a pitiable condition. And as a result of this, when the Britishers came with their European ideas of rationalism, liberty, equality, fraternity, the Indian intelligentsia became very curious and wanted to imbibe it in our culture as well. So students, these were some causes because of which we see the growth of socio-religious movements. Now in that, students, even if you write 3 or 4 points as a part of the rise and growth of socio-religious movements, that will be enough. Be sure to take care of the fact that you have to differentiate between the social movements, the religious movements, and what were the causes that they were highlighting or they wanted to change in the society. Once we are done with that, we are done with the first part of our question. Then we proceed towards the second part of our question, that is highlighting the contribution of the Young Bengal movement and the Brahmo Samaj movement with respect to the socio-religious movements of 19th century. In that, students, simply you start with the contribution of Brahmo Samaj. So in that, you will start with the point that who started the Brahmo Samaj, that is Rajaram Mohan Roy. What was the main reason to start Brahmo Samaj? That was to purify Hinduism, which will be based on reason and rationalism. Apart from that, students, you can also talk about the literary publications that were created as a part of Brahmo Samaj and what they were highlighting. So you all know Rajaram Mohan Roy was a very famous champion of women rights. He specifically highlighted the problem of sati, which was widespread in our society. So he was against the practice of sati and wanted to abolish it, and because of that he started Brahmo Samaj and started spreading the idea of this social ill. As a result of this, students, even Rajaram Mohan Roy was successful in incorporating the support of Britishers, and ultimately sati was abolished in our country. Apart from that, students, some religious reforms were also highlighted as a part of the creation of Brahmo Samaj. That is, they denounced polytheism and idol worship. I had already told you in the previous slide that apart from social reforms, certain religious reforms were also envisaged by these newly emerged intelligentsia, wherein they wanted to change the Brahmanical orthodoxy. So the idea of idol worship or worshipping many gods was something that was denounced by the Brahmo Samaj, and as a part of this, Rajaram Mohan Roy also wrote a very famous book known as the Gift of Monotheism to prove that ancient Hindu texts support monotheism. So you can see how they want to change both the social evils at the same time the concept of religion in the society. Apart from Brahmo Samaj, students, Rajaram Mohan Roy also set up another organization, that is Atmiya Sabha, wherein he wanted to propagate the same idea of monotheism. Also, students, as I had told you, Rajaram Mohan Roy attacked the Brahmanical orthodoxy, and hence, as a part of it, he criticized the caste system, the idolatry and the rituals which were prevailing as a part of Brahmanical culture. He also wrote a very famous book, students, which is known as Percepts of Jesus, in which he incorporated the religious teachings of many religions. With that, he wanted to explain the philosophical message of the New Testament as well. Finally, students, you can see that Rajaram Mohan Roy was placing reason above these religious scriptures and religious authority, and wanted to bring about a change both in the social setup and the religious setup of the society. As a part of this, when we see the success part will be that he was able to influence the Britishers, and ultimately sati was abolished. With respect to the religious reform, students, there were organizations, but we do not see a major change as a part of his contributions. Moving on, students, the second organization that is mentioned in our question is the Young Bengal movement. Just like the Brahmo Samaj, we start with what the Young Bengal movement was, and it was started by whom. So basically, Henry Derozio, students, is the person who is associated with the organization of Young Bengal movement, and he is considered as one of the early nationalist poets of India. Apart from that, students, this movement drew its inspiration from ideas such as liberalism, liberty, and equality. Already, students, when we were talking about the rise and growth of the causes of the rise and growth of social religious movements, we had understood that these ideas of Western liberalism, etc., were brought in by European companies, which were very much influencing the thought process of Indian intelligentsia. And hence we can see that one result of these influences is the Young Bengal movement. Now, this Young Bengal movement took up causes such as the education of women and the freedom of speech. They also gave a lot of importance to the concept of rationality and how a person should question the people in authority and not blindly accept whatever is being imposed on them. Apart from that, students, the people who were a part of Young Bengal movement joined the social, economic and political questions, and they were questioning how the Britishers were ill managing or ill administering our country, leading to pitiable condition of the people of our country. As a result of this, the Young Bengal movement also demanded the better treatment of Indian labor in the overseas colonies of these European powers. So you can see, students, both the organizations in a way are trying to highlight the causes of social reform, such as looking towards the ills that are against women in the society, such as sati or the widow remarriage or the education of women. On the other hand, students, the Brahmo Samaj particularly wanted to reform the Brahmanical religion as well, wherein they wanted to do away with evils such as caste system. So from this, students, you can see that your body, if you have written these 3-4 points, your body will be absolutely complete. So 3 or 4 reasons pertaining to the rise and growth of social religious movements, and then 3 or 4 lines pertaining to Brahmo Samaj and Young Bengal movement, wherein you will talk about the founder, you will talk about the key ideology of any organization, whether it is talking about social reform or whether it is talking about religious reform, and then in the end whether they were actually able to find any type of success. Okay, so in this way you are going to organize your data with respect to both the organizations. Finally, students, when we come towards the conclusion of this particular question, you are going to arrive at a neutral conclusion. In this neutral conclusion, students, you will point out both the positive aspects of the creation of these movements and at the same time how they were not able to actually achieve a lot of success with respect to their pursuits. So in the first part, students, you can say that the social religious reform movement had laid the groundwork for the development of nationalism and also prepared a cultural atmosphere for the growth of nationalistic ideas. So clearly, students, if the Indian intelligentsia is talking about liberty, freedom of speech, challenging the authorities, this makes the masses mentally prepared to challenge the British rule in future. However, students, when these particular movements were actually operating, at that point of time, they did not have a lot of close links with the masses. At the same time, they were unable to address the grievances of people such as peasants or workers in Bengal, and their movements were more bookish and theoretical in nature. They had no idea how to actually apply it in the social fabric. So both the positives and negatives will be given in the conclusion, pointing out to the examiner that there were both positive achievements, at the same time certain setbacks that can be seen as a part of the socio-religious reform movements. So with this, you can answer your question in a wholehearted manner.
Amrita IAS Academy.